Localizing finance, specifically talking about cash and voucher assistance. We would have a very lively discussion today, so really looking forward to be discussing and hearing thoughts from all who are attending this session. Let me just quickly start off by introducing myself, then I'll pass on to my colleagues who can give you a walkthrough of what they've been doing and where they're coming from. My name is Bilal Khanzada. I am the Director for Cash and Voucher Assistance and Lotus 20 implementation at Save the Children International, based in London office, but obviously working remotely. With that, I'll pass on to Emma to give you some background about where she's coming from, and then we can dive into questions. Thank you. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Bilal. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to meet you virtually. My name is Emma Delo. I'm the current technical team manager at the British Red Cross, where we're working to support Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies and the wider Red Cross Red Crescent movement to scale up the use, quality and timeliness of cash, so improving people's choices who are affected by crises. Previous to that, I headed up recovery and cash at the Federation Secretariat in Geneva, and before that, held quite a few roles in livelihoods with cash and markets, mainly in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, with the Red Cross Red Crescent family, or the movement as we call it, but also with Oxfam GB, CALP, and UNESCO. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to some exciting, interesting questions. Thank you. Over to Claire.
Thanks, Emma. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Durham. I'm here today as a steering group member for the newly formed Local Procurement Learning Partnership, where we're looking at improving the timely, relevant and efficient use of local procurement. But prior to that, I was working alongside Emma in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement for the last 15 years in logistics, but for the last 7, supporting cash and voucher assistance. And I've supported more than 40 countries in implementing cash and vouchers through local financial service providers. Back to you, Bilal.
Thank you. It will be a great discussion. We've got an ample experience there. So just very quickly, my background before joining Save the Children International was having spent about 16 years with a international bank, looking after the development sector, which included multilateral, bilateral agencies and microfinance institutions. Just to give you a quick background on that. If there are any questions, this is to the audiences, please use the chat box. Those would be passed on, and I'll be happy to actually ask those questions from your side to our speakers, and we'll respond to all questions that are possible. There were certain questions that were previously highlighted, which we will start off to have the discussion with. And the first question, which was raised previously, was how can local financial service provider assist in an emergency and disaster response? That's the question, and in no particular order, whoever wants to go first to respond. Emma, Claire?
Go ahead, Emma.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. So, of course, local financial service providers can really assist and support in times of crisis, and the quality of the collaboration between humanitarian agencies and those financial service providers is really critical to delivering assistance well and with good quality. There are many aspects that FSPs, as we call them, can assist with, and these include offering a broad range of cash services in all key geographical areas, ensuring agent coverage of those locations and ensuring that those agents have sufficient liquidity, trying to assure that costs are realistic. We could look at fixed costs for transaction fees, for insurance services, etc. Those FSPs can look at their ability to scale up services after a shock and ensuring that business continuity, which we'll come to in a moment, and being able to implement security measures that can ensure that customer safety. One area of real interest is around financial inclusion. We know that around 75% of adults who are living in countries coping with humanitarian crises today remain outside the formal financial system. And that's where FSPs and humanitarian and development organisations can really work together. At the same time, more and more aid agencies, we're providing cash through electronic means and digital payments. That's particularly increased in the current COVID pandemic as we all look at ways to reduce the risks of transmission. This presents new opportunities to link humanitarian assistance as a catalyst for more financial services by working with FSPs. We did, British Red Cross and the ICRC did a bit of research back in 2018 on some projects in Kenya and Nigeria, and we really came to understand that financial inclusion, whilst not being the primary objective, that is the humanitarian imperative and the need which must be met first, but it's useful to have that as a secondary objective. And if we want to try to use cash assistance as a stimulus with financial service providers to meet and increase the ability of people to access financial services, then we need to focus on more training for people, helping people improve their financial literacy, and working with those financial service providers to make sure that they're able to provide those services to new and diverse areas of clients. So lots of work to be done, but a very critical part of the humanitarian work. Thank you.
Claire, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of Emma's points. I mean, of course, yeah, financial service providers, local providers, they understand the context, they have appropriate solutions, and people who are involved in receiving aid, they often prefer a local provider. It's someone they're perhaps already using, and so ensuring that people have the choice of how they receive their cash and who they receive it through is really important as well. And of course, a local provider is able to do that. And yeah, they are often very much aware of the disaster or crisis in country and are able to have contingency plans in place. So for example, I was in Nepal after the earthquake, and one of the remittance companies there had managed to get the Kathmandu branch up and running again in less than half a day. So they're also part of the solution when we see disaster and crisis. But I'd also say that some of the lessons that I've learned is that local providers don't always have the same level of maturity from country to country or even within a country. So it's really important to understand the capacity of the local providers. Often we have to work with them in a partnership to build that capacity. And sometimes we're so familiar, I think, with working with sort of large global providers that we don't always think about working with smaller and medium-sized suppliers and thinking about how our processes do or don't work with that, the tools that we have, how we do our tenders. We often have to adapt these, and I think it's really important when working with local providers to be thinking about that. And there's not necessarily one size fits all with how we work, and so it's important to engage with providers and understand how that works.
No, perfect. I totally agree and echo what you both said. So, I mean, like in a nutshell, if we can sum it up, it does actually leads towards localization, which we are trying to encourage. The same kind of economy in terms of bringing the unbanked to the banking sector, banking world where possible. And I really like when you mentioned it's not one glove fit all. It needs to be tailored to the local context, local situation as well. Using local service provider usually have more acceptance locally as well of the perception that has been created. And lastly, as Emma very rightly pointed out, it does lead to cost reduction. So anything that produces more can be something that can be reached to the end beneficiaries in what we are trying to support. Brilliant. It started off and kicked off quite well. The next question that has been posted to us, and I'll pick up some questions or comments when they come through, is how can voucher and cash-based assistance provide multiplier on local markets? What advantages do they have on traditional form of humanitarian assistance? So if I can rephrase it, what do you think, in your opinion, CVA would or cash and voucher assistance helps to achieve in comparison to other modes or means of actually distributing?
Okay. I mean, I can give a very real example. So one of the first cash responses that I was involved in was in Jamaica. We were actually testing a regional prepaid card, and when I met with people, and these were people who had suffered from a house fire, and they were familiar with getting assistance, normally in the form of goods, and they said to me, the food boxes were great, but one woman in particular said to me, I can buy fresh food with this, and I can buy a particular brand of cheese that her little brother liked. And it just really hit home about how you can treat individual people as individuals, and they can really make the best choices for themselves. And for me, it was just like, I was already pretty sold on cash, but then to see it in action, it was just like, yeah, this is really clearly how we can provide things that normally we can't provide, and allow people the choice to get some normality back into their life by just choosing the brands of foods they like. And so for me, that was a really simple example of why this is such a powerful form of assistance.
Emma, thoughts, anything to add?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, fully agree with Claire. I think those, we know that cash can have those, really enhance those multiplier effects on the local economy. It can enable and support people to purchase food and other items locally as they would not in times of crises, and can help strengthen those local markets so they can recover quicker and be more resilient to shocks in the future. Humanitarian interventions that transfer any resources really can increase economic transactions. It's just that's quite enhanced when that's liquidity and cash assistance, and that sets in motion income multipliers at the local economy level. There's some evidence there's an ODI paper who looked at multipliers of cash transfers from social cash transfer programming in sub-Saharan Africa, and estimated that those multipliers can range from kind of 1.5 to 2.5, which means if $1 million is injected through humanitarian assistance, it would generate an additional income of $500,000 just from using and making those kind of choices. So it's really important to look at that. And how do we do that? We try to understand and analyze relevant market systems and value chains of the key commodities and services that crisis-affected people need or have lost access to. And that's really critical for us to ensure that we're in line with the humanitarian principle of not doing harm. That's not doing harm to people, to organizations, but also the local economies and market systems that people live in every day. It's been proved that investing in rehabilitating critical sections of that market system, which could be the infrastructure, it could be storage facilities, it could be advocating for exceptions due to humanitarian circumstances for certain regulations, can be a really effective way of meeting humanitarian needs within your resources. And we call that market-based programming or market-based interventions. So it's really important that we look at how we provide assistance. We try to look at cash and markets where it's available to make sure that we're taking advantage of those multiplier effects. There are cases of where cash is not relevant everywhere, as I'm sure we'll talk to later. And of course, in-kind assistance or goods providing people with the things that they need can be really important in terms of timeliness. But we do also know that where that's used without understanding cash and the markets in which people are living in can sometimes result in people selling those goods in order to get cash to pay for the things that they want to. And we had one example in Bangladesh. Cash is delivered largely across host communities, but for some of those communities in the Rohingya, in-kind delivery can be preferred. And there was an interesting Ground Truth Solutions report last year that noted that the Rohingya and host communities preferred a combination of cash and goods, and we find that's quite common really. And they wanted cash to be used to purchase medicine, clothing, food and household items, with over 50% of refugees saying that they did sell some of the in-kind goods they received in order to purchase some of those items. So it just really shows the importance of understanding those market dynamics, understanding what role assistance and impact will and won't have, and making sure that we come back to the principle of do no harm and take advantage of those multiplier effects.
And I just wanted to add one thing to that. The other thing that we've been looking at is around forecast-based financing and thinking about how we can provide money ahead of time, because what we've seen in crisis after crisis, particularly with people with animals, losing those, they're not able to take them to the shelters. And by able to provide that money ahead of time, we can actually also save money that way, where people are able to pay for someone to house their animals outside of the expected crisis zone. And that's just so much more efficient. It just makes so much more sense if we're able to do that ahead of time.
No, totally agree. I think you both summed it up very well. The way I used to explain or sum up what cash and voucher assistance was to reach out to the end beneficiary in the most dignified manner possible, whilst there is a proper audit trail. Again, you've given great examples of Bangladesh. Similar cases came through in Syria, where 70% of the refugees said we have sold it, barter system, or they actually give it to shops who buy it on subsidized rate. And then obviously when they buy it on subsidized rate, they sell it on subsidized rate. And people who are buying it, when they buy something on subsidized rate, usually links to inferior quality. It might be of the superior quality, and then the news clipping comes in, UK government giving inferior goods to refugees in XYZ, and could lead more harm than good. So yes, cash, when we refer to cash and voucher assistance is really suited. It brings in dignity back. A mother knows best what to buy. And there have been proven interesting researches by ODI and others who have actually said how the impact has, by giving them the choice, how the impact have actually shown the evidence of having higher impact on that as well. On that note, there was another question, if we can start off with, which was, what do you think are the challenges to calculating whether or not voucher and cash-based assistance is appropriate in a particular situation or not? Is it always the best option? I think Emma already touched upon this slightly when she was explaining, but worthwhile to elaborate further, please.
Thank you. I can't hide my passion for cash and voucher assistance. It flows, but you know, it's clear there are those benefits for people's dignity, for people's choice, as well as making, you know, humanitarian aid budgets go further. We can see reducing assistance and funding through official channels, and so we need to find ways to make what we do go further and have greater impact. So it's really important, you know, against the backdrop of increasing urbanisation, we know that most people operate in some form of cash economy in normal times. So it's really important that we don't ask, should we do cash or not, but we start to ask, why not cash? In which situations is cash not relevant? And then the secondary question might be, well, when cash? When will cash be a useful stimulator for the economy and for people? That said, I must admit, even as a cash champion, that cash is not suitable in every situation, of course. Where there's disruptions to local markets, where that's severe, where emergency goods can meet people's needs more quickly than local markets can provide, where there's a high risk of inflation, perhaps due to limited goods or a lack of goods in the market, or if security conditions mean that giving people cash might leave people vulnerable to attack or theft, they'd be times where we wouldn't use cash, and in-kind assistance and other service delivery would be better. How do we work that out? As practitioners, we do cash feasibility assessments. So of course, you know, needs and capacity assessments happen overarching. So they look at people's, what people affected by crisis needs by analysing the context, the situation, and how those needs have been affected by the hazard. But specifically to cash, we're looking at a community and a household level, what are people's preferences? Do they have a preference for cash, for payments, for digital, for what are they using now? How can they access the use of that cash? How do they have access to markets? and what markets and financial services there are available, and are there any risks there that we need to be aware of. We need to think about political will and government policy and how conducive that is to providing cash to people. And the really important one is also those markets. Are they functioning? Are they integrated? Are they competitive? Can they meet people's demand for key commodities and services to the right level, the right quality and the right price? We also then would have to look at our own and other, humanitarian actors, our organisational ability to deliver that cash quickly and with the right safety and risk management processes in place. And are there any risks that make this an unacceptable response? But of course, a lot of this is about mindset shifts. Providing cash through humanitarian assistance requires you to work in a people-centered way and understand that people will prioritize their own set of diverse needs according to their own priorities. And that does require a shift from perhaps more traditional ways of delivering assistance. Yes, lots to do.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add to that as well. What do we mean by best? I think really like unpacking what we mean by best. And it's not cash or goods, but it can be cash and goods. It can also be an agile approach where we start with goods, for example, and then we move to cash as we get that up and running. So I think trying to think about it in those more combined approaches, I think, is useful. Preparedness, of course, also plays a huge part. A lot of my time is spent explaining how long the procurement process takes. And even if you have emergency procurement process, that still takes quite a lot of time, particularly if you're trying to set the requirements for a service. So if you can be prepared and have contracts in place, of course, that means you can go much faster. But best may also mean taking into account how long it's going to take to get cash up and running. And also, I think really going in with an open mind and thinking about whether it's cash or goods, and not moving, as I've sometimes seen, where if we can't give electronic cash or direct cash, moving to a voucher system. But sometimes the voucher system becomes very complicated to implement and to reconcile. And actually, it doesn't offer the choice and the dignity really that we're expecting. So there are times, I think, when we can say, look, this voucher system is really in-kind goods, and actually we might be more efficient and effective to actually just move back to goods. And there's not a failure in doing that. It's just about understanding the current environment we're in and not just pushing to do cash and vouchers to say we've done it, but where it really truly makes sense. And I think, one of the things about where it is and isn't appropriate, again, an example from my own experience with Greece, where we've been talking about hygiene parcels and saying this is crazy to be sending hygiene parcels, and those are very specific to the country. But actually in Greece, we had a set limit for how much money we could give people. And for families with young babies, particularly needing diapers, that can eat up most, if not all, of a cash grant that we're providing people. So actually, sometimes those very expensive items, providing those in kind, can really make the best use of the assistance that we give and really make it the most effective and appropriate for people. And so again, coming at it with an open mind, I think, is really critical.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much, both. I think that sums it up. The only thing I can specify and add to it is, and this is based on actual experiences. One, where it's not appropriate when you see there are no identification documents available. It's kind of an egg and chicken situation, because there is no differentiation by a financial service provider. An individual being paid upon ID is an individual. It's just a transaction. So there is no segregation, as is the case with microfinance institutions as well. The ground reality is most of the beneficiaries that we rely on have flood emergencies or hostile situations, and they do not carry original IDs, which is a main pain point setting up accounts as well. Alternative for that is finding a community elder who's doing it, and that leads to misuse of power. We've seen a lot of cases for that. And lastly is knowledge. Technically, if I won't go into detail, but very quickly, if I can share one of the places where technically it was the best solution that was given, which was issuance of debit cards, but the local context and knowledge was not taken into account, which led to individuals standing in front of ATMs, charging X amount of money to operate the ATM, and then lending off the ATMs to individuals for literally barter and everything. Very interesting cases that have come up. So thank you so much for summing this up. I think it's suited where its operational market are operational. It can add to the economy rather than have a pull down effect where it actually does more harm than good. We are still having some questions that might come up, but in the meanwhile, another question that was shared previously is, how have voucher and cash-based assistance added people during COVID-19? Can this type of aid play a role in overcoming the obstacles posed by the pandemic? This is quite interesting. I think you will have a lot to say on that. Whoever wants to start off with. But before you start off, I think Emma again touched upon it. It was an interesting read where I heard as of June 2020, there were 133 new countries who had taken up CVA in some form of social assistance program. So that speaks a lot. And then I'll hand it over to the experts, which is yourself.
Okay, Claire, or shall I go? What do you prefer?
Oh, you go. I mean, I can just say, I mean, from my workload, I think I was supporting around 30 countries. So yeah, when COVID hit, my workload just went like this. But Emma, you have much more of the detail.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, across the movement, there are 80 plus national societies who are national humanitarian actors linking in with their governments through their auxiliary role, who are planning to use and are starting to use cash in this COVID pandemic. Lots of those who have been investing in cash for many years, but many of those national societies new to cash, just really recognizing, you know, what they're seeing as those socioeconomic needs requires cash response to really sort of help people in these difficult times. But even before the COVID, you know, the backdrop against some of those things that were there as the COVID pandemic occurred, you know, those increasing climatic and weather related events, increasing risks. We know the proportion of disasters attributable to climate and extreme weather events has increased to 83% in the 2010s, affecting 1.7 billion people. We've seen increases in protracted conflicts, huge increases in food insecurity, and then we've got that COVID pandemic on top. Huge health emergency with those widespread socioeconomic effects, just increasing the complexity and the protracted nature of these crises. We've got a humanitarian system that's trying to sort of keep up with the current crises and all the emerging threats and risks against a backdrop of you know, potentially funding gaps and decreasing official development aid in many countries. So we've really got to sort of do the most that we can to the best that we can. The impacts, we've really seen sort of reduced household incomes, people's reduced purchasing power, increased unemployment, underemployment, increased expenses for health, education, and meeting basic needs, use of negative coping strategies, as well as greater kind of protection and psychosocial risks. And we see that across the board, don't we, in our own countries and other countries as well. I think one of the things to really note that we've seen is, you know, there's been a huge increase, hasn't there, in social protection mechanisms from governments as they seek to support those needs of their citizens, or the most vulnerable of their citizens. And we're seeing an increase in cash that's linked into those national social protection mechanisms. And COVID's really shone the spotlight on national actors and the importance of national capacity to ensure that humanitarian assistance can be fast, it can be appropriate, and it can be where it needs to be most, which is at the localist level. Delivery through cash can be a safe option. We've seen that uptake linked to social protection, but also, as I mentioned earlier, cash can be provided fairly remotely or more remotely than perhaps more traditional humanitarian assistance through goods provision. So there's less clustering at distribution sites, there's less time or needed for groups of people, therefore reducing transmission risk. So for the movement, where are we with cash? Cash is huge for us, and that's really increased this year with COVID. We're on track. We're on track to deliver more than 1 billion Swiss francs to more than 6 million people in more than 100 countries, and this year has really been a boost to us meeting of those targets and making sure we use cash as it's appropriate and as it can most help people. Some of the scaling up of social protection has brought some really interesting learning. We know that from World Bank research on measures taken by 215 countries and territories, at least $800 billion has been invested in social protection over the last year. This amounts to more than 1,400 social protection measures, and about a third of those took the form of cash transfers, reaching more than 1.1 billion people, or in effect, around 14% of the world's population. So some traditional forms of assistance, I mentioned the relief kind, are showing their limitations, and we have real renewed emphasis, as rightly so, on localisation and strengthening national resource response capacities that are in place. National actors, which for us are our national society, our sister national society members, are that essential link between communities and their governments. They can amplify the voice of affected people and ensure that that's at the heart of the response that's designed. Good practice will rely on that strong national capacity, which in turn really requires investment into preparedness. And I really hear the points Claire made earlier. We're constantly seeking sufficient resources for those national actors to build that preparedness capacity and grow in strength and sustain that strength over time in all areas, in delivering cash, but also things that are so essential to that cash, such as data use, information management practice, addressing the digital divide, being able to ensure connectivity, working with those FSPs as we talked about at the start of this, and investing in community feedback mechanisms and how to make sure that that amplified voice is accurate, is true, and is real time. We did in the British Red Cross with various movement partners, we have just worked on gathering learning around some of that initial work linking cash with COVID, and we've got a couple of sort of key learning points. The COVID crisis has certainly helped national societies focus on supporting government and social protection systems. For some, like the Turkish Red Crescent, like Kenya Red Cross, that was already a very strong focus and partnership prior to the pandemic. For others, as I say, that's been something that's been organic and has grown more during the pandemic. A second learning point is that national societies need more clarity on the definition, scope and practice of social protection. And we know that's there for the whole humanitarian sector. How do development and humanitarian actors start to speak the same language, start to ensure that we're talking about the same things, we're having the same quality standards, we're linking up from one to the other. And I think this pandemic's really shone a spotlight on that need. A third learning point is that the role for us a national society can take really depends on that social protection context and how mature those mechanisms are. It could be supporting on registration of people, on targeting people, on that community outreach, being able to have those relationships and disseminate information and community voice. It could be on delivering the cash. There's a huge range of services that a national society can play, and that's really depends on that context and on those specific contextual relationships. We know that there's risks as well as rewards to engaging with national social protection programs. You know, where they are weaker, of course, we need to be very careful about how those ongoing needs can be met over time. And then a key lesson, you'll have no surprise, we've mentioned it already, but is to make sure those national societies are cash ready and can be strong in all aspects of cash delivery. And we really do that through investing in cash preparedness. We've got around, there's around 60, 65 national societies we know out of our 192 membership who are really long-term investing in being those partners of choice and having the right capacities across the board to deliver cash to high quality standards where it's needed most. We know that governments need to be cash ready too, that, you know, we're really including government officials in a lot of that cash preparedness work, so that as that, oh, sorry, my monitor's about to turn off, that would be unfortunate, apologies. So that where, you know, governments and national societies are together working through what cash ready looks like, what do those quality standards look like together. Some of the other sort of more practical things as well we learned are that, you know, ahead of crises, we should be looking at how we target, some pre-registration with people, looking at pre-agreed cash transfer values for different aspects. That could be meeting basic needs, it could be contributing to livelihoods protection, other protection objectives, and even further into helping people ensure a level of well-being throughout a crisis. And that all of that has to be done kind of before something happens. But we're still learning. We're committed to trying to gather the breadth of experience from across our present national societies and bringing that over. But there's some initial learning points. Thank you.
Claire, anything from your side?
I don't think I can add much to that. I mean, Emma's really laid it out well there, and the learning points there are really interesting.
No, I totally, again, echo what you guys have said, and that's there is a very important need for a proactive approach rather than reactive, which we are seeing in a lot of cases. So totally agree. Preparedness work, not just preparedness, the bare minimum. One of the things that has happened in Save the Children is we've got these framework agreements in different countries, so that every time there is a new award that comes in, instead of running a huge tender process and coming back to Claire's point, knowing, because systems don't speak to each other, it all starts from scratch. And then lastly, taking a calculated approach rather than just, because it's preferred by the donors, let's implement cash or voucher or whichever is the preference from donor side, which is usually said, cash is better because of multi-purpose cash. And we can speak about this in a lot of details. I'd say yes, but there needs to be a differentiation. When you enjoying cash and you're mentioning cash, that means hard cash. So you get the benefit of not being relying on KYC requirements to the beneficiary that you can enjoy when you're giving out hard cash. When you talk about mobile cash or mobile money or electronic money, it requires the same set of requirements for setting up an account. So there is a different understanding that is there. On that very nicely note, there has been a question from the audience, which is that what role do new technologies, this was the first one. In what way can the private sector assist with new innovations in this space? I love this question, whoever asked this. So over to you guys first. And
we have certainly engaged with the private sector on this. We've spoken with a number of different global players. And I think it's about understanding each other. So a lot of the services that we're using, they're not humanitarian services, they're standard services. And so for us as humanitarians, understanding the limitations or the challenges of those services. You mentioned KYC. So yeah, having these screenings against our recipients is something that does not sit comfortably with us, but it's in local legislation. So we have to find a way, and certainly some providers have been looking at how they can find a lighter version of that, or a version where perhaps the screening is on the agency and then there's sub accounts. So yeah, we are always looking to see where, where this innovation can come in. We absolutely think that cash is going to be best provided more or less with the private sector. We have some internal closed loops, but there is some huge benefits, of course, to using existing systems. It links to Emma's point around financial inclusion, so that the products or services that we introduce people to stay after we have left, and they still have access to that. So yeah, it's about understanding, I think, each other, and for the more that they understand us and what we need and the challenges that we are trying to solve. And so therefore, these framework agreements that you talked about, by having these long-term agreements with providers where you can really work in partnership to develop the products, because we often have to start with a product that perhaps is not ideal. But as we understand each other, and I think the other thing when we're doing the procurement is really being clear on the requirements and not using our jargon. So we might say we want to register beneficiaries, but what we mean is a bulk registration through an Excel spreadsheet, and a bank is used to registering an individual. So us explaining what we mean in clear terms and us trying to understand what these service levels of service are is really important. And I think that only comes through collaboration and working together.
Emma?
Just really to second what Claire said, I mean, there's real opportunities there. A lot of values already come, of course, from the private sector in working with new technologies and advancing the cash space. We can, particularly as humanitarians, have the private sector help us to solve some of our common problems, some of those common blockages that we see time and time again in operations. They have expertise that is different from ours and that we can benefit from, particularly when it comes to cash delivery and payments and modern technology. There's also a lot of learning that we can get from them. Not least, how do we work with the private sector as humanitarian organisations? Those FSPs, those financial service providers, those data management solutions, those digital ID solutions, all of that is an area where the private sector can really help us and help the humanitarian effort with their expertise, with the technology and the other systems that they can contribute to the humanitarian effort. I mentioned data protection, the digital divide. We still work in communities where there's a lack of financial infrastructure, let alone internet connectivity. And they're huge things about what people deserve and what we need to bring to and work within communities. And I think the more that we can work with the private sector to harness that expertise and what they can offer, the more we can focus on what we're sort of good at, which is engaging in that community, making sure people are deciding on how humanitarian assistance is provided, and we get the most out of that assistance for crisis affected people.
No, brilliant. Totally, again, agree. There is a lot that private sector can help achieve and can work both ways, actually. As you very rightly mentioned, Emma, there are things that they would know. So it's sort of the CSR arm of private sector is something that usually charities are not exploring to the extent that it should be explored, because then there is a bit of flexibility and advocacy as well with the regulators saying these are humanitarian principles. So they can be a joint approach that could happen. And there are innovations now by financial service providers such as Lotus 20, that's something Save the Children is currently working in, where there are two major banks contributing towards creating a voucher system, which will not rely on identification documents. You can capture something without compromising and getting the actual image in place. And lastly, I think the sooner we start with this, the better it is, because it's human lives and it's affecting people in a lot of locations, and we've been on the ground a lot of places. With that note, another linked question that has come through from the audience is, and it's totally linked, which is what role do new technologies like cryptocurrencies have in supporting humanitarian action? I love this. It's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we're still looking at that. I don't think we necessarily have all the answers. I think it is being open to seeing what's out there, but it's also making sure that we pick something that's appropriate. So it's not just something like it has to fit with the work that we're trying to do. And I think not everything does. Either doesn't right now, or may not fit. And so sometimes it can be a challenge trying to understand these new technologies, trying to understand how they work for us. That can actually be quite a lot of work for us. But I think it is important for us to see, what is out there. And also finding ways, and this is sometimes some of the challenges I think with procurement processes, if you just want to pilot something, or if you want to do a small partnership, that free of charge. So trying to find a hybrid solution that enables us to pilot some of this stuff, enables us to pay for it somehow, to build a partnership, but recognizes that a small startup might not have all the resources to do a full tender. And how do we manage that? So I think working program, innovation colleagues, procurement colleagues, how do we make that kind of thing work? Because often we just want to see in reality, how does it work? And does it work for us? And the learning, of course, on the other side as well, about how they could make a product more suitable for us.
Well said, Claire. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is to pilot, to understand what benefits this new technology, be it cryptocurrency, be it distributed ledgers, digital ID solutions, what benefits they can make to the humanitarian outcomes we're trying to deliver. And to not be afraid of using and testing these new things. There's a lot of different practice going on in the humanitarian sector, isn't there, at the moment? And the key, as Claire's exactly said, is to learn from that, to roll that out, to implement that where that works, and to keep a check on the clarity of our humanitarian imperative, and trying to do the most that we can do with the resources that are there. And thinking about green and our impact on the environment at the same time.
No, brilliant. Totally, again, in agreement. Just a follow up, just another additional question that sits very nicely on what we have been discussing, and that is, there has been a lot of discussion in the humanitarian world and globally with private sectors as well. What do you think, as based on your current experience and future looking as well, what can be done to encourage prompt decision making and unified approach rather than people working in silos? This, I mean, the humanitarian and different charity sectors doing a great job in isolation, but bringing them together and, jointly taking some immediate action.
I mean, I would say from my experience, certainly with cash being new for everyone, and I guess coming from logistics, where logistics has been around for a long time, we are perhaps can be more siloed, but we do have the logistics cluster and we have other fora where we come together. But my feeling, and Emma, let me know if you feel the same, is because cash was so new that actually there was quite a lot of collaboration from the beginning. I think we in the cash teams have sort of showed to other parts of the organization how that collaboration really can work. And I think there is quite a lot of support out there to do that. So I feel that that's there, and it's really helpful. And to have fora like this where people can showcase and discuss, I think is also really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Claire. Fully agree. It's we're in a unique time where there is quite a lot of coordination, at least at technical levels, with programmers and agencies around cash. And that coordination is just so important, isn't it? In most operations now, there are national cash working groups that are often chaired by national societies or co-chaired by those national actors. And they're a really important, vibrant group who are, I've been in quite a few of them, and it's always practitioners trying to come together to map out, ensure there's not duplication, ensure. In Haiti we had a joint M&E framework, monitoring and evaluation, so we could actually divide and conquer. We said, okay, what do we need to know about this operation and what we're all distributing? Okay, let's share that. Let's not duplicate. Let's not Each of us sends out different monitoring questions to the same communities. I mean, that's horrific, isn't it? So really having that coordination, making sure the grant values are of the same level so that people living in different places don't get different people. It's delivered in the same ways. And if we go negotiate with those financial service providers, we are much more attractive if we're a coordinated body rather than 10 separate people. But all of that coordination really needs to come behind and strengthen those national local actors. Because coordination structures and different things, they come and go, but what's there are those national actors who are responding every day to the everyday emergencies, as well as those big emergencies that make the media and bring international instruments. And that's the really important thing, is to make sure that those governmental actors and local national actors are in the driving seat of the coordination efforts.
Perfect. It's excellent. And you touched upon a very interesting point, which is the overall trust factor towards the charity sector, which has resulted in, if my memory serves me correctly, around a 5% dip in 2019 to around $29.6 billion, which is a 5% dip from the governments and other charities given to the charity for humanitarian assistance. On that, keeping that in mind, what do you think, what would be your thoughts would be on different forms of financing? Because a lot of charities, you've struggled with unrestricted funding. So what would you be your thoughts on trying to generate some funds? I know there is a lot of questions, and maybe a new session needs to be highlighted for this. But because a lot of charities struggle with unrestricted funds, what do you think can be done to bring in local players where there can be bridged financing or unrestricted funding available to charities, which can result in prompt preparedness activities and use it rather than rely on what the restrictions are by donors and local regulations?
Gosh, what a question. The billion-dollar question, one might say.
I really want the session for this time around to have some concrete steps of actually jointly taking proper decision, because this would be really interesting to hear, because you've got a lot of experience. So it will be very interesting to hear. Maybe the Red Cross is not in the same boat because you tend to probably have unrestricted funds, but other charities who struggle with this. I've been hearing this for the past 20 years. I've been connected with this world for directly, indirectly, but I was just wondering what your thoughts on that is, and it could be just general.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have some views on it. Don't worry, Bilal, whether it's accurate. But the real thing is about for investing in preparedness, for getting quality right and getting the systems and the ability to respond to those big emergencies in peacetime during between cyclical disasters. Building that preparedness, that's incredibly hard to fund, whether restricted or unrestricted or otherwise. And we just need to find ways to have a better narrative around national actors and what they're responding to every day. And that's clarity around the results that they're bringing, not just the outputs. So not just we delivered X number of this or we delivered X number of cash grants, but so what? Telling that story of what difference that made to people's lives, I think, is incredibly effective in fundraising terms and attracting new donors, both nationally and locally, as well as perhaps, the more traditional international donors and things. I think, that's the key is having that results purpose, and also then looking and being sure that all of our systems, our audit requirements, our financial systems, everything is strong and robust. And that's what will give that confidence to fundraising efforts and to be able to do more. It's a challenge though. It has to be, I think for different charities, that coordination factor is really important, because it's about who's good at doing what. We don't all need to do the same things. This is really the time where I hope and know that different charity agencies will will really need to specify what they're good at and what they can uniquely do that isn't done by other agencies, and that may mean, you know, decrease in the number of actors working on the same things, but perhaps that's a necessary step that's coming.
Yeah, there's not much to add to that, but it is chicken and egg, of course, isn't it? To get the funding in, to be able to demonstrate that you have done well with the funding, to be able to get more. I mean, it's the challenge to get your foot first in the door. But hopefully some of the grand bargain aspects where donors have also coming to provide more funding in that way. Hopefully those things are starting to come into fruition now. So we start to see people being able to then deliver programs that they can demonstrate the impact of.
Perfect. And final thoughts before I give the floor for you to have your final say. We are finally coming up to the end of the session, so we'll wind it up quickly. Thank you very much for keeping it really engaged and really informative. But very quickly, what do you think, in your opinion, if charities don't up their game, as in like in terms of actually giving the risk approach, proactive preparedness work, do you think there would be a place where there'll be a shrinkage of actually charities working in this environment and more commercial entities working on that, and we become a research arm?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, Emma, you already kind of mentioned this point around the bits that we are good at, the bits about engaging with communities, about understanding targeting, understanding needs, putting people at the heart of our programming, which is what we're trying to do and which Cash does really well, but then working collaboratively with the private sector for the delivery, for the innovation. And I think it really does take both parts, because it's not just about cash delivery, is it? It's about finding the most appropriate needs. It's meeting the most vulnerable people, the people that perhaps don't even get seen in society. You know, these are often hidden communities, and I just don't think that we can do it alone, either side. I think we have to do it collaboratively. That's my feeling.
Perfect.
I agree.
So
well said, Claire.
That's excellent. With that, final thoughts from both of you? Anything that you would want to make sure that it's flagged or highlighted, because this is obviously being recorded as well? Now's the chance. I know we are all supportive of cash and voucher assistance. That goes without saying.
I mean, from my side, I would say like preparedness is critical. I would say logistics and procurement is critical. We have to work as a team together. And open-mindedness in terms of, is it cash, goods, services, or a combination? And those would be my 3 points that I think people should consider when they're looking at CVA.
I think
final thoughts.
Oops, sorry, thank you, Bilal. Thanks, Claire. You know, considering the title of this theatre group, so localising, finance and leveraging local response, I think the key is that preparedness of local national actors. We have got to shift the model. We've got to take localisation as the driving force of a lot of what we do in the humanitarian sector, how funding decisions are made, how power-related decisions are made, and we need to prioritise national, local humanitarian actors and resource them appropriately, as Claire's mentioned, with the preparedness support. Thank you.
Brilliant. That sums it up very well. Since there are no more further questions, just a quick recap. Cash is right if it serves the needs. It's not applicable or suitable in all locations. Please do use it. It's cost effective. It has been proven, like microfinance institutions and microfinance, which brings in dignity. So it goes without saying, use it, but don't use it as a tick box exercise when it serves the community we are trying to facilitate, and also the local economy, which is going to contribute towards it as well. Thank you to both of you for taking out the time for extremely informative information I hope you, and sorry to have put you in spot in certain stages, that was not the intention, but I really appreciate the responses. It's great that there is uniform stance on what can be done. For those who are listening in, please, if there are any further questions, first of all, thank you for attending the session. And lastly, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box still, even if at the end of the session, that can be passed on to specific speakers, and those can be picked up at a later stage.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bilal. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.